Okay. There's a text here that I've got that I could introduce you with, but it's always so stiff when you read from text to introduce somebody. Would you like to say a few words about yourself, Eleanor? And
I
I'll
can I can introduce
be.
myself.
Thank you very much.
Save you the trouble. Um, Hello everyone. Hey, läget. Shalom aleichem. Speaking all of the languages. I'm Eleanor Goldfield. I'm a Swedish American creative radical journalist and filmmaker. I'm currently based in Baltimore in the United States, so-called United States. And yeah, I guess I'll just dive right in if that's cool with everyone.
Go for it. Thank you.
All right. Um, so victims of the LA fires, fueled largely by climate chaos, which is fueled by capitalism and colonialism, will receive a one-time payment of $770. Now, if anyone's ever been to LA, you know that'll barely buy you a cup of coffee. Meanwhile, Israel will receive $8 billion in weapons on top of the billions that they've already received, a continuing stream of death and destruction, of propping up a colonial project of Israel founded, as Winston Churchill so succinctly put it, in the interest of British Empire, now perpetuated in the interest of US Empire. I bring that up to say this. People who don't make the connection between ecocide and genocide, between climate chaos and war, are either profiting from it or being conned for the sake of those profiting from it. The US military, backed ideologically and physically by the Swedish government, is the single largest polluter in the world, equal to that of 140 countries. And as I like to say, that is a terrorism that affects us here at home, as evidenced by that insulting $700 to people who have lost everything, to more than 20 million people who have fallen into extreme poverty just during President Biden's office, to the tens of thousands of children in the richest country in the world who are unhoused and hungry. The children in Gaza, unhoused and hungry, all courtesy of US empire. The fires that have engulfed my friends' homes in Los Angeles come from the same embers as the fires burning people alive in Gaza. It is a settler, colonialist, capitalist, genocidal, and therefore ecocidal paradigm that fans these flames. And we have more in common with the people of Palestine than we do our own politicians, and I say that as a US citizen and as a Swedish one. That unintelligent sycophant with a Napoleon complex, Ulf Kristersson, and the Joker stunt double, Ebba Busch, with their tongues so far up the ass of US empire, can go right and fuck themselves. And it is far beyond time that Swedes recognize that the Sweden of Olof Palme or the Sweden of these democratic socialist PR campaigns doesn't exist. Just like the US that Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of does not exist. And it's okay to mourn that. It's okay to grieve that. But it has to be an active grief. It has to be the kind of grief that topples empires. Because what Sweden is staring down right now, thanks to becoming effectively a US colony, is a deluge of death and destruction. And as a child of empire, I can tell you what it looks like to have an entire generation brainwashed and broken by war. I can tell you what it's like to have friends commit suicide because they can't deal with what they did over there. To have friends not come back from over there. To have friends who come back never the same because of the deep moral injury. The knowledge that what they did was not for freedom or some other bullshit, but for money, for colonialism and imperialism, the battering rams of capitalism. And I can tell you, unfortunately, after doing this for 20 years, I can tell you what doesn't work to fix it. Voting. Now I know Sweden and Germany and the UK have more than we have, which is basically one party, but still, the only thing that has ever and will ever affect real change is to target the gears of the war machine. And that doesn't matter how many parties you have. You can march, or as I like to say, parade. You can call members of parliament and send them emails, but don't expect it to have an effect. Marches, for instance, can be a great way to go public with something, for photo ops, to invite people in by making colorful signs and coming up with fun chants. But it's the work that isn't seen, the work that isn't shared on social media and paraded on streets that actually makes a difference. And while I will never publicly condone it, we have to admit that, for example, here in the US, Luigi Mangione did more for healthcare in 10 seconds than tens of years of organizing has. And we got to grapple with that. Direct action gets the goods it always has and it always will. Because the powers that be don't actually care what you think. And the US, as has been proven by a 2014 Princeton University study, is an oligarchy. And I ask you, is your country any different? Sweden, Germany, Italy, France, Spain. Does the will of the people matter? And if it doesn't, how do we act? How must we act to change the extreme pushes towards genocide and ecocide and global fascism? To quote an Armenian human rights lawyer, Karni Kirkonian, who I interviewed ahead of the morbidly absurd COP29 in Azerbaijan, he said, "Those with genocidal intent do not stop. They must be stopped." And the leaders of our nation are on a path to becoming kings of a graveyard of children, of countless species and ecosystems, of ceasefire deals and broken promises. In the US, each president, regardless of party, has become more fascistic than the last. Each one has spent more on war, more on ecocide, more on police, our domestic military. And again, is your country's story any different? These nations, Germany, Sweden, Spain, etc., that have tied themselves to a sinking empire, is that story any different? And I know that people love to say things like, well, Americans voted for Trump, so they deserve it. Or, you know, people in Sweden voted for SD, so it's their fault. This is an unhelpful argument, and it's also not entirely true. For instance, here in the US, we had realistically a choice between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. If it wasn't a deal breaker for Harris voters to literally step over the bodies of Palestinians, including tens of thousands of children, why should it be a deal breaker for people who voted for Trump that he's racist? What's missing for a lot of people here and in Sweden is the analysis. We are the most propagandized people in the world, although Sweden is really trying hard to beat us at that. I actually expect more from people in Sweden because you still have more time and ability to know better. I don't blame a single mom here in the US working 3 jobs that she doesn't know about US foreign policy. I do blame family members of mine in Sweden who live comfortable lives with 2 months vacation and free healthcare for not knowing that their country is a goddamn US colony. I do blame them for that. We have to expect better of ourselves and our neighbors. We have to build awareness through political education, critical media literacy, as in knowing that we're propagandized, and a lot of listening. We have to build alliances with people who voted for Trump and for Harris. We have to ask our community members, okay, why did you think that voting for the likes of Ulf Kristersson would save the day? We have to build bridges with these people. And I'm not saying that as some kumbaya bullshit. I'm saying it is a necessity. I know that I know a lot of these people. I know the people who, for instance, in West Virginia voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary and then Trump in the general. Why? Because they hate Clinton. And I can't blame them for that. I do too. Their analysis is warped, but the foundation is correct. They don't trust the Democrats. Similar story for a lot of people in Sweden. They don't trust the socialists. Okay. So then what? We have to work with that analysis. And people don't need to be told what it feels like to be frustrated with their lack of ability to pay for things the way that they used to, that our elders are struggling to pay for things. And a lot of people on the right, you know, Thea makes it sound really nice and simple. Blame the immigrants and, you know, we got it covered. We have to understand these stories that people tell so that we can step in and show them reality and listen to their lived experiences and their reality and find where we can build together. And again, I'm not saying this is some kind of kumbaya shit. It is hard. It is frustrating, and it has to be. There was a great piece back in 2023 by Kelly Hayes and Mariame Kaba called "How Much Discomfort is the Whole World Worth?" And it talks about how organizing spaces, again, the real ones, not the shit that you see where people are holding a sign outside of the White House. Organizing spaces are not supposed to be comfortable. They are spaces that will require us to get uncomfortable. They write, organizing on the scale that our struggles demand means finding common ground with a broad spectrum of people, many of whom we would never otherwise interact with, and building a shared practice of politics in the pursuit of more just outcomes. And I talk about this more in my podcast, Radical Nuance. I talk about, of course, we can't organize with everyone. This is not an all or nothing binary. As my friend and mentor, may she rest in power, Kilu Nyasha, once said, some people are just going to die wrong, and that's okay. And, you know, for instance, I've said this in Jewish organizing spaces. I'm always ready and willing to speak with Jews who are struggling with Zionism, who are grieving over our communities being ripped apart by parents disowning kids, etc. But what I won't do is I won't speak to avowed Zionists. I disown you. I'm not building that bridge. It's not my job to try and talk to avowed fascists about not being a fascist. I'm much more likely to be talking with people who have questions like I do, like, hey, what do we do about this? Who feel uncomfortable but aren't sure why. Like sitting on a porch in Louisiana with an old white guy who doesn't understand pronouns or what the hell toxic masculinity is, but he doesn't like Trump and he doesn't like Clinton, and he's open to talking about it. Or a library meeting room with a bunch of coal miners, listening to them talk about how they'd like to have jobs that don't give them black lung and when they die at the age of 42 and what that would look like. Sharing our lived experience with each other and finding that, again, we have more in common with each other, more in common with Palestinians, more in common with people in Congo, in Sudan, in Venezuela, than we do with our ruling class. Understanding that and finding through the discomfort where we can build, organizing where we are, organizing with your people for your getting really uncomfortable. I can't stress that enough. And yeah, absolutely. Find a core group that gets you where you can be comfortable and fully safe. Take care of yourself. You know, rest is also radical. But we have to really, in order to connect the struggles, we have to connect with people that are also struggling. And that means that we have to connect with people who don't agree with us on everything. And it has to get uncomfortable, and we have to be prepared to shut up and listen, and we have to be prepared to not have the correct pronouns used and things like that. Because ultimately, this all goes back to the same thing. We can't trust the powers that be to take care of us, because they never will. And at some point, it's our own damn fault for trusting them, for believing them, for thinking this time will be different or this election will be different. To quote James Baldwin, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. Know where our enemies are and where our community is, and don't confuse the two. Don't punch down. Know where solidarity can be built from Gaza to Georgia to Göteborg and back again. We got to analyze tactics and information and be fluid, but never flimsy. And we have to be dangerous. So, då tackar jag för mig. Thank you. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Eleanor. Very poetic. If you've got any questions there in the audience, please write them in the chat or put your hand up. We've got some problems with the microphones, as we've heard, so you can't just shout out. Active grief. Interesting term. I'm more familiar personally with active hope, which perhaps you're nodding, you're familiar with it as well, I guess. You're also talking about building alternatives. What are some of the things that you think, which alternatives give you most hope or do most to assuage your grief? No, really? Okay, so where are you there?
Yeah, well, so I think active hope and active grief go hand in hand. The brilliant and unfortunately past Cleve Benally put it, he has the kind of hope that burns cop cars. I have that kind of hope as well, and I have that kind of grief. And I think, you know, part of a grieving process is doing something about that. And just sitting here isn't going to make me feel better. Right. So an active grief, I think, looks like, for instance, one of the things that I'm really working on right now is connecting labor to what's going on in Gaza and how the war on Palestine and Palestinians, the war on, you know, whether that wherever the US is, whether there are 1,000 military bases across the globe, that we cannot have our needs met here at home when our entire government is built on oppressing people across the globe. Partially because that's where all the money goes, but partially also because you can't expect the US to be a terrorist in foreign policy and then Mr. Rogers at home. That's not how things work. So making that connection gives me a lot of hope. There have been some meetings with the Palestinian youth movement and US labor unions, which are not very strong, unfortunately, but people are working on building them up again. So that gives me a lot of hope. Again, like connecting these issues, recognizing how our lack of healthcare here is directly connected to the bombing of hospitals in Gaza. Our inability to make rent is directly connected to the genocide in Congo, right? Like these things are connected. And so making those connections, I think, is really important. And then again, with labor, you have that power, because what's more powerful than a general strike if you grind the gears of the US economy to a halt? So those are the things that that fuel my hope. And yeah.
Thank you. Are you able to stick around for another 90 minutes till the end of this particular session, so we can have some interaction with you and the other speakers in this session? Or
yes, I might have to jump off and do a couple of other things, but I can circle back.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see then. Natalia, ask you to activate your microphone. There you are. Brilliant.
Yes.
And I just say you're active in the Youth Anti-Racist Network, United Intercultural Action.
Exactly.
Yeah, and please add anything else about yourself which is relevant for this evening in your presentation.
Does it work now?
Yeah, now we can see it.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yes. So good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here at the conference where the themes of solidarity, peace, and climate justice intersect with each other. And as already mentioned, I'm the possibility to speak here arose from my involvement in United for Intercultural Action. It is an European organization uniting over 560 organizations across Europe that are fighting for human rights mainly. And as an intern, I there support delegations and advocacy. And beyond this role at United, I'm also an active member of the Deserteurs- and Flüchtlingsberatung. It's an initiative in Vienna that is doing free asylum law consultations to migrants and refugees in order to educate individuals on their rights and the available support systems. Oops. And additionally, I'm also facilitating workshops for a German initiative about the topics of democracy, asylum politics, and the name of the initiative is Verein zur Förderung politischen Handels, which means basically fostering active citizenship through participatory methods. And before going deeper into the topic, I would like to highlight first United's role in promoting solidarity and human rights. And I would say that United operates mainly at the nexus of activism and advocacy, empowering marginalized voices, amplifying the voices of grassroots organizations and youth in policy spaces in order to create sustainable solutions. And this approach also aligns with building strategic partnerships where collaboration with NGOs, institutions, but also intergovernmental bodies brings anti-racist perspectives to the forefront of global discussions. And through these partnerships, United can effectively contribute expert insights in policy engagement and shaping policy.
Natalia has frozen.
Okay. And yeah.
We lost you for a second there.
Ah. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Yeah, otherwise just say something. And yeah, as already mentioned, I am studying international law, and this perspective also allows me to view global challenges through a legal lens. And I believe that international law offers essential tools and a framework, or can offer some tools that can address transnational issues such as human rights violations, environmental degradation, and forced migration. However, of course, we know that laws and frameworks are only as effective as their implementation and the political will behind them. So, especially in the area of migration, let's take the principle of non-refoulement that some of you might know, which is a cornerstone of refugee protection under international law. This principle prohibits states from returning individuals to countries where they face persecution. Yet, we still witness countless violations of this principle, particularly in Europe, where asylum seekers face pushbacks at borders, inadequate reception conditions, and discriminatory policies. And I think that strengthening these enforcement mechanisms for such laws would be crucial to ensure their effectiveness in the end, because otherwise they're not worth anything, or not much. But at the same time, we also must recognize that even the enforcement mechanisms often depend on the political priorities of governments, which leads to selective application of outright disregard of international obligations, which is why the civil society has an essential role to play in holding governments accountable and advocating for the enforcement of international norms. Yes, and now I would like to get over to my experiences in working in my asylum law consultation and to the principles that we built up there. So one principle is the accessibility of legal aid. So we offer legal aid without financial barriers, ensuring that everyone is able to access these informations about their rights and possibilities. Furthermore, we try to offer individualized support on equal footing, creating space for dialogue where individuals are active participants in navigating their own paths forward, trying to listen to specific needs and aspirations of individuals to them. Then a next principle is that we try to ensure fair support. So we try to offer assistance to individuals facing systemic barriers, prioritizing the urgency of cases, the rights and needs over any procedural or financial calculations. And then for me, this also demonstrates how grassroots initiatives can complement larger advocacy efforts by addressing immediate needs while still pushing for systemic change. Yes. Then, yeah, in the context of United, the organization, I also wrote an article about political repression with Todd, who's also presenting tomorrow, and there we were tackling the topic of resistance and political repression worldwide. And as you may know, Dr. Gubat Ibadoglu, an academic and peace activist, has been a vocal critic of corruption and labor exploitation in Azerbaijan's oil and gas industry. Today, he's under house arrest, denied essential and medical care. Similarly, Baru Samadov, a doctoral researcher and outspoken critic of the Azerbaijan policies as well, was detained on charges of high treason. For his academic work and advocacy, he now faces a potential prison sentence of 12 to 20 years. And these cases illustrate the lengths to which regimes will go to silence dissent and quash critical thought. But these are not isolated stories. They are part of a global pattern of repression targeting those who challenge entrenched systems of power. Yes. And what we witnessed in Azerbaijan is not unique. It echoes around the globe. According to Global Witness, over 2,100 environmental defenders were murdered between 2012 and 2023, with Latin America bearing the most number of them. In Iran, environmental activists have faced imprisonment under fabricated charges. Furthermore, in Belarus, opposition leader Olga Karach was sentenced to 12 years for her advocacy work. I think she will be also presenting tomorrow on Saturday, and yeah, I'm really curious to hear her insights firsthand. But even democracies, suppression takes more subtle forms. In Sweden, a climate activist was dismissed from a security classified job following a targeted media campaign. Italy recently enacted laws criminalizing eco-protests, with penalties reaching 5 years of imprisonment. This global pattern is why the role of organizations like United in amplifying the voices of those silenced by repression is indispensable. By, for instance, sending delegates to COP29 and being present there as civil society, United is pushing for accountability in climate action and human rights. Okay. Now I wanted to share some thoughts on solidarity in general. And to me, solidarity requires us to recognize our shared humanity and the interconnectedness of our struggles. Climate justice, for instance, cannot be achieved without addressing the disproportionate impacts of climate change on marginalized communities. Similarly, peace cannot be sustained in a world where economic inequality and systemic discrimination still persist. On a more personal note, I grew up in a small village in East Germany where some part of my family still lives. And there I've encountered firsthand how solidarity is often misunderstood. In conversations during family gatherings, also around Christmas now, it became clear to me how easily solidarity is mistaken for mere charity. And I think that this misunderstanding often creates a divide between a fortunate us and unfortunate them. Solidarity, however, I think is fundamentally different. It can bridge these gaps, emphasizing our shared humanity and collective responsibility. It is mutual. treating others as we wish to be treated, recognizing that what affects us ultimately affects all. And I think that this mutuality ensures that solidarity is about collective responsibility and shared benefit and not just one-sided generosity. A few days ago, I also heard a very fitting metaphor in a podcast. I don't remember the exact name of it, but it described solidarity as the social glue that binds individuals and communities together. And this glue is strongest when it is universal, ensuring that everyone contributes to and can also benefit from the collective good. Unlike the approach of charity, which is selective, solidarity means recognizing that we all play a role in and benefit from shared support systems like education, healthcare, and social services. It can strengthen our social fabric, foster inclusivity, and our democratic resilience. I think that through these conversations that I had, I've come to see how articulating the distinctions between solidarity and charity can help bridge divides and foster mutual understanding for each other. True solidarity challenges us to move beyond division, building connections rooted in justice, mutuality, and shared humanity. Okay. Despite its importance, surprise, surprise, solidarity still faces significant challenges. And I think that three key barriers stand out to me. On first hand, it's short-term thinking due to the fact that political systems mostly prioritize quick wins over long-term investment. This leads to mostly underfunded social and environmental initiatives. Then there's the division and polarization through social media and identity politics often lead to division, framing public spending as benefiting others rather than the collective good. Then there's the political fragmentation, where I think that the growing divide between socioeconomic and educational groups makes it very difficult to build coalitions for solidarity. And yeah, I think that instead, to overcome these barriers, we should focus on universal policies that foster a sense of shared purpose. And this universality could minimize stigma and foster greater public support. Yes, then let me come to the political education initiative where I'm active in as well. And as part of my work there, as I already said, I facilitate workshops focusing on democratic topics such as asylum politics, democratic discourse, and populism. And this initiative is committed to fostering political engagement and promoting democratic values such as freedom, equality, and solidarity, particularly through innovative and participatory approach methods. By creating spaces for dialogue and understanding, political education can help to counter division, encouraging mutual respect and strengthening the social fabric, fostering a society where individuals can support one another and work collaboratively toward shared goals, to see beyond their immediate realities and recognize the interconnectedness of our struggles. Through interactive discussions, simulations, and expert insights, the workshops can create a space for young people to understand and engage with the broader systemic issues that drive inequality and exclusion, including those perpetuated by populist rhetoric. However, we know that education alone cannot address the barriers that hinder solidarity. The structural inequalities that divide us, such as economic disparity, discrimination, and unequal access to resources, are entrenched in the very fabric of our societies. And these barriers, compounded by political and cultural divisions, create an environment where solidarity is difficult to cultivate. The growing polarization of our societies exacerbated by issues like education, reflects deeper systemic challenges that we must confront. Nowadays, I think that education even became one of the most significant divides, creating a growing gap between those with higher educational attainment and those without. While education is a tool for empowerment, it can also become a dividing line in political discourse. Political debates and policy decisions often reflect the perspectives of more highly educated groups, leaving others feeling excluded or unheard. The political rifts this creates further undermines the bonds necessary for collective action. And this is particularly why I think that solidarity in moments of crises, but also in the everyday struggles that define our human experience. And this is where I think that education becomes a crucial lever, a mechanism through which we can actively work to break down divisions and create spaces for dialogue and collaboration. As we navigate an increasingly polarized world, we need to remember that solidarity is not given, it is a practice that we must nurture and sustain. And by promoting education that encourages critical thinking, empathy, and action, we can create the conditions for solidarity to flourish. Together, we can then build a more inclusive and resilient society where no one is left behind. Okay. And now to come back to the topic of this conference, solidarity, peace, and climate justice. This reminds us of how much these issues are interconnected, as we already said. And true solidarity means standing with those who are silenced, not just in words, but through tangible action. It's about recognizing that the struggles of a refugee in Austria, an environmental activist in Iran, or a peace advocate in Azerbaijan are interconnected. When we defend one, we defend all. Peace cannot thrive in the absence of justice. In conflict zones where resources are extracted at the expense of communities, dissent is often met with violence. International law can provide tools to hold perpetrators accountable, but it is up to the civil society to demand their enforcement. And the environmental degradation disproportionately impacts marginalized communities who often have the least capacity to act. Yet these communities are also at the forefront of climate activism. By amplifying their voices, we not only fight for the planet, but for equity and justice. Okay. But the connection between solidarity, peace, and climate justice should not just be theoretical. It is a call to action. Recognizing the shared roots of these challenges, our next step must be to translate awareness into tangible strategies for change, ensuring that our efforts inspire and motivate collective process. So I think that amplifying initiatives, expanding their reach across Europe and beyond, we can share resources, expertise, and platforms and expand the impact across Europe. I mean, for that is also to provide tools and education that empower individuals to understand and navigate societal changes. While international law is for sure far from being perfect, it provides tools to combat human rights violations and protecting the environment. Governments must be pressured to uphold these laws, and we must educate individuals about their legal rights. That's why we need to advocate for their enforcement, ensuring accountability and justice on a systemic level. Additionally, solidarity must span across movements and partnerships, bringing together activists, policymakers, academics, and community leaders, whether for racial justice, refugee rights, or environmental sustainability. By recognizing our shared goals and acting in unity, we can achieve more. And then I think that events like COP29, for instance, are important events where we need to be present to highlight struggles of marginalized groups and ensure civil society voices are heard, advocating for long-term systematic change. Everyone can contribute to demand accountability through various forms of political engagement, whether by participating in demonstrations, signing petitions, contacting elected officials, supporting grassroots organizations, or sharing credible information online to raise awareness. These actions, no matter how small, collectively build the momentum needed to drive change and ensure that every voice counts in the fight for justice and equity. All right. Yes, I think that as civil society, we hold immense power to enact change. And I think that transformative action often begins at the local level, where communities can create spaces of protection and inclusivity. So I hope that all of us have some things in mind where we can engage ourselves actively. And I'm really happy to have been able to share my perspective and experience with these topics. And if you have any questions, you can also reach out to me, or we are also very open to receive more delegates if you're interested in experiencing these topics from the side of an organization. Then you can just scan the QR code and you should come to a forum. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia. Great to hear your perspectives on these things, both deepening perspectives that we've heard and adding new variety to them. I noticed in your the slide where you show sort of the barriers to solidarity. Those barriers don't seem to be accidents. They seem almost to be sort of systemic, really. Put in place perhaps by politics, and you also reiterate the need for the grassroots. I was wondering what you've seen as examples of education that works, that comes from the grassroots. What have you seen that sort of has a big spread and a big effect in terms of educating young people and others to some of these issues that you've been talking about?
So for me personally, even though I just began doing these workshops a few months ago, so I did not have, I had 2 so far, and I have another one in February, and it really depends on the group, I think. And sometimes I have a group that is quite undiverse and that has a very good parental background, and then I think the common ground that you have is already quite set and you do not need to explain too much. And then you can see that a lot of things you tell young people, it doesn't move them so much because they are already very well educated on everything that has been happening. But then I think that for me, the things that make the most change is when I feel like we get into discussions and those young people feel like they are also seen with what they are saying. So the approach of this initiative is also to create a space where, in general, every opinion is able to be verbalized and is able to exist. And then we need to contextualize it and try to add information. But I think that this is something very important. And this is what also creates some unity for people who have opinions that they normally might be scared of sharing, being able to verbalize them and not being automatically judged by others or by the facilitators, but actually being seen by them, or feeling like there's some understanding of, okay, why do you have this opinion, and I back the reasons why you might feel like this is the case, or why you might take your position in that way. And I think that this is something very, it's also quite challenging for me in some moments, but I try to uphold this this attitude towards the young people that I'm with.
And what sort of contents do you have in the workshops? I assume you're holding the workshops, and you've done a couple. Yeah. What sort of things do you go through in those workshops?
So the workshops I did so far was on asylum politics as well. So they, it's always a German-speaking group, mostly from the North Rhine-Westphalia region, and we often meet in Brussels so that they can also see the European institutions. So it's often topics that somehow have to be combined with European policies, and yet have somewhat of a connection to German policies as well. So it's asylum politics, it's democratic discourse, it's populism. So these are the main pillars right now, I think, that I am doing in the workshops, at least. Okay,
great. And you take them to Brussels to show them the EU as a way to scare them, or as a way to encourage them?
Yeah. I think it's also to motivate them, because otherwise maybe we wouldn't get too many registrations if it would only be the political subject to trick them into the workshop.
Thank you very much for that. Are you able to stick around for another nearly an hour until 8 o'clock?
Yes.
Great.
Till 8 is possible for sure.
Yeah, brilliant. And then we can have a little group discussion perhaps at the end if Eleanor comes back as well. Thank you very much. Amos, I'm going to ask you to... There we go. That worked quickly. Nice. Great. And we can hear you as well. Oh, I'm so happy.
Super. Okay, that's great. So good evening, everyone. Tord asked me just a few days ago to join this session also, as I'm working on both anti-repression work, and then I'm involved in grassroots organizing for climate justice in Extinction Rebellion. So I have no special presentation here, but Tord just asked me to give a short kind of analysis of what's going on with the movements I'm involved with, fighting for climate justice, and also looking for some common themes for different civil society more generally, globally. So my name is Amos Wallgren. I'm based in Helsinki, Finland. I'm involved in the climate justice movement more generally in Europe, different platforms, but for the last years, most importantly, Extinction Rebellion, which might be familiar to many of you. And I'm in XR Finland. I'm involved in strategy work, both and also legal strategy, especially, and funding. So this kind of quite pragmatic and resource management issues also within the movement, which are quite essential, especially times when activism, or there's no kind of easy wins, but kind of long struggles ahead. So we have to kind of plan in the long run. So that's kind of what I do in XR. And then I'm also part of a newly founded network called Legal in Action that was founded in Amsterdam last October, which is kind of a network in which the legal teams of various environmental movements and climate movements share experiences and exchange know-how on how to react and kind of oppose the growing criminalization, repression, different forms of limits to the right to protest, and kind of the shifts in the kind of what one could call kind of the space in which civic society operates. So that's part of my current things that I'm involved with. And maybe just to give a kind of, in many countries, Extinction Rebellion was a thing 5 years ago, but it's no longer around. And kind of the general kind of bigger trajectory of the newer climate justice movement that started some 5-6 years ago in many countries, Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. The trajectory of these movements was kind of giving a kind of very general picture that the COVID pandemic and kind of all the limits to demonstrations, then the kind of general fragmentation within the movement into smaller and smaller newer fractions, and then also kind of a polarized discussion climate in which activists were seen more as a kind of threat to security and as a general nuisance, and also then the war in Ukraine creating kind of a change of focus, kind of, okay, what are the big issues now? So all of this together with the growing repression that Natalia just described very well in the presentation of how in the European cases, something that could maybe be called soft repression. This soft repression also kind of limited higher fines, longer sentences, even though it's not as deadly as the terrible forms of repression seen in the global south, it still can kind of halt the movement from mobilizing and gaining the goals it set for itself. So the situation is not the easiest for the climate justice movement that or the ones I'm involved with, and we're kind of looking for inspiration from different cases, and it's always good to have these platforms for kind of international conversations and seeing how different movements, the Palestine Solidarity movement, the anti-racist movement, more generally, climate justice movements, environmental movements, the peace movement, how we can help each other. And there I think the anti-repression work is one important issue. But what has kind of, I think another kind of shared issue is the new forms of kind of authoritarianism, eco-fascist, neo-fascist, or in anti-democratic, illiberal maybe. There's a lot of terms that come to mind, and I think there are nuances to the new forms of authoritarianism we see around the globe that are worth kind of differentiating, as as I said, the repression looks different in for example, Nordic countries compared to when we in Amsterdam we had conversations with activists from Extinction Rebellion in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there the issues they're fighting with, the violence takes such a different form that analyzing is, even though the struggle is common and we are even part of the same movement, the tools are quite different. So there I think the analysis of how security becomes how security has become a over kind of arching concern in society, going before any other concerns, is one way in which even seemingly established democracies can suddenly turn into something much more authoritarian and less open. So because this kind of new obstacles to the movements fighting for climate justice and peace, we founded this network to share experiences, and I'm also part of kind of academic efforts to try to understand these issues. So I'm doing a PhD in Helsinki with activist friends who are trying to, from the perspective of law, international relations, and sociology, get some kind of hold on where we are going, how the developments around the obstacles to the right to protest, how they are moving from one country to another, and how the hard right and far right governments adopt similar policies and laws that they take inspiration from, for example, the UK and Italy, that have been kind of on the forefront of the new repression of activism in established democracies. So this is kind of my major kind of topics: anti-repression, very practical organizing work, how to get funds, how to get people involved, and seeing whether or not we can get more people involved and get better organizing for the coming campaigns, and then also the kind of academic analysis of where are we going in the larger picture. I have not been very actively involved in the peace work, so it's always interesting to hear what's going on within the global peace movement, and I think there's also common issues and also common enemies, sadly, but also that it's good to identify the enemies and see what we are fighting against. So as I have only kind of I just joined quickly to give an overview of what's going on in Extinction Rebellion Finland and the Legal Inaction Network. I think as it's quite late, I won't take more than this 15 minutes. And I'll give it back to you there in the studio.
Thank you, Amos. Extinction Rebellion and the climate justice movement, you explained that they kind of died a bit of a death, and we noticed that here in Sweden as well. If you were to do it again, if you got to design the movement, what major changes would you make, do you think? Is that maybe that's come up in your PhD studies, or just your own opinion?
I think that's a great question, and actually, as a matter of fact, I think we did something different a bit in Finland,
okay.
And compared to other countries. And Extinction Rebellion is not called Extinction Rebellion. It's not kind of it's called Elokapina, which is in Finnish and is Rebellion for Life. And it didn't look the movement didn't get the profile of being some UK imported activist project, but it seemed much more natural, and it was also led with maybe a maybe different, quite data-driven attitude, which is quite peculiar. I think in the activist scene that many of the people who were designing the movement had a background in computing and information kind of data sciences. So then we had a huge amount of knowledge on, okay, we did this, what happened then, and how much people have joined the movement in which year, and how much media attention, and how much funding and support we have received, and how many like central coordinating roles have been filled. So I think that's one part that we got inspiration from, mainly Extinction Rebellion Netherlands, which has been able to organize some of the largest directly climate-related anti-fossil fuel demonstrations in the last years in Europe, with some 20,000 people blockading the highway in The Hague. And we had a kind of interaction with them on how they did it. And this kind of has led to also Extinction Rebellion Finland doubling kind of participant sizes in the last years, which is a bit unusual. But thinking about how it could have been done on a global scale better earlier, I think one of the analysis of Extinction Rebellion, I think, has been quite thin. Like it's mostly about asking the politicians to do the right thing, and there's not much. What next? They didn't do it. They gave us maybe some. They declared climate emergency, but it didn't lead to much anything. And I think there the effort of Extinction Rebellion to, so to speak, be beyond politics and be kind of beyond the left and right divide, and being just generally green and progressive, has been a great limit to the movement's kind of larger goals. On the other hand, it has made it very approachable, and many people have it easier joining the movement because it's not associated with party politics and doesn't have a strong stance on, say, foreign policy. But on the other hand, I think it's a loss. The movement could be so much more. And that's kind of one part of the work. I'm also involved with strategizing how to bring in a more broader agenda from degrowth literature, from decolonial studies, from eco-socialist kind of visions of how we could have a better future. So those are elements that now are kind of, we try to have a kind of joint learning process, collective learning process in the movement of how to make something better out of the movement that still has some 4,000 members, which is more than most in similarly sized countries.
Is it going to be you who starts the movement when it restarts, do you think?
Let's see what the direction is. I think we there was, for the last year, we were kind of on the defensive. I'm wondering if the XR will be criminalized. That was kind of more of the case, but that would also be a time to fund a new movement. So let's see. But now lately it was mostly just, okay, let's go survive this year and see that we don't have to go to jail, all the organizers. But now it seems that Finland has survived in that sense, or the rule of law, that this has not been a huge crackdown on the movement, even though similar crackdowns have been seen in other countries in Europe recently. But now we're kind of trying to reinvent the movement for the coming years.
Reinventing the movement, great. Natalia, I wonder if you've got any reflections that come up, or comments on what you heard from Amos. There were some similarities there, I think. I mean, one question that I thought of when Amos came up was, what about politics and what about education? What have you seen? I mean, you said the people that come to your workshops are perhaps from a quite similar background. How do you educate for activism, or is it education for sort of changing the system from within, so to speak? And I'm going to have to ask you to do that, and then you can do that.
Yes, thank you, Amos, for presenting. I really enjoyed listening to you, also because I was involved in Extinction Rebellion for a while, but it's been a few years ago already, and now that I moved to Austria, I think the scene here is not that active, but I do associate a lot of good memories and good relationships with the movement. So it was very nice to hear from your point of view. And to come back to your question, well, generally speaking, we need to remain as workshop facilitators in a neutral space. So we cannot propose certain movements or certain parties to engage with, but in the end of each workshop, what we do always, and what is really important for us, is to do like a engagement landscape where we have mountains where you can engage in, and we write down different things, including civil disobedience. So we do mention the fact that, okay, there are different possibilities to engage yourself with, and you have to decide on your own based on your feelings towards it, your resources, which is the suiting type. And we just try to not judge the one or another, and also to not prioritize it too much, because we are dependent on public funding, and I think Germany is quite strict on this. And I think we could get easily in trouble if children would support, children would talk about this with their parents, and then I think the initiative could get, especially when advertising initiatives that are politically a bit controversial. Yes, but I mean, we can still mention different possibilities to engage politically, and this we do for sure. And I think it's important to not blend this type of activism out, but to make it transparent and to normalize it also in the discourse of how to engage yourself in the political discourse. Yeah.
Eleanor was speaking about, for example, challenging your family, and you were saying, Natalia, about, you know, if we talk to young people and get them to activate, you know, that they'll challenge or educate within the family. Is that something that either of you have seen done or have an opinion about? I don't know if you can unmute yourself, Amos. I'll press that button and then you should be able to. Yeah.
Yes, I think I can. Well, maybe it's not about family, but maybe about reaching over generational gaps and kind of into building surprising coalitions. Some of the environmental movements in Finland, Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion, blocked a Russian coal transport in spring 22, and this was seen by many as a kind of surprising move, as the state had already done all the kind of boycotting and kind of moves to hamper the Russian war economy, but then the trains with coal, this anthracite, like stone coal, were still transported for a few months, and it was a situation in which then also locals who didn't have anything to do with the kind of or any understanding of the climate justice movement, but just were against the war. They wanted to join in and support us, and it built kind of a quite surprising mix of coalitions. Also, solidarity from Ukraine. We were mentioned in national news there then, and it was a kind of moment of building bridges. Also with a I just remember, like, as an anecdote, one older man who came over with his car. He looked like, well, an older man who maybe remembered the war, and he wanted to tell us that he showed a thumbs up and said that the Russians bombed the local train station, and he still has his anger about that, was even though he wasn't personally kind of touched by it, but he wanted to say that it's good what we do, even though he thinks we are quite annoying when he has heard about us blocking cars in the city. He doesn't like that, but this is good. At these moments, I'm not sure what like weight or importance to give to this, but it's interesting to see how suddenly some bridges can be built between movements. And I think I just heard some reports from Serbia recently about the anti-government protests and how also quite unusual coalitions have been built up with people from progressive climate justice movements, and then also people engaged more in like nationalist politics against the large Chinese corporations and US corporations extracting resources, and also against the corrupt government. So I think that these examples are curious, and that's maybe where some hope lies for some larger mobilizations in the short term.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add, Natalia, at the moment?
Yes, I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, because you asked something about confronting your own family, right? Also, did I?
Yeah. What was it? I said, yeah, you were talking about sort of educating young people so that they can influence their family, and Eleanor had a more sort of confrontative attitude. And I was just wondering if that do you take any inspiration from that kind of more hands-on active grief, you know, the energy that Eleanor brought to the conversation? Do you think that has a place in the work that you do, or you know, does that broaden your perspective, or do you or not?
Yes. So I think, I mean, I think that it is super important for sure, and I'm very glad that this kind of activism exists, even though right now I am not an active part in civil disobedience movements anymore. But I think that right now in the organizations I'm involved in, or this has been an approach that has been building up in the past few weeks also, where I have deepened my relations with my family in Germany, because I didn't have contact with them for a while, also because of the political disagreements we had together. And I think that I was very confrontative for many years, and I think that at some point, I mean, it does give me a lot of motivation as well to see this collective power and to be within those protests and see the collective strength that people have within movements. But I think that I like to be there, but I need to have a rather passive role, because in this active role that I had for a while, I could feel that I was also building up some kind of energy that was becoming destructive, in the sense that I could also feel a sort of cynicism maybe even coming up, and hatred towards positions that were so far from my own and from what was important to me. And I think that this is really dangerous, and I think that some people are more opposed to it than others. And I realized that I do have this tendency that I can get into this destructive anger, and that's why it's good for me to focus on other ways of protest, I think, or have an active role in other forms of protest, and stay on the side of the confrontative protest where I do not engage emotionally too much, because I think that that's what's best for me and for my environment as well, or for what I want to achieve. I think it's sure. And but I think it's very inspirational, Amos, to hear from you, and you seem very calm and peaceful while talking about it. So yeah, it's great.
Thank you for that nuance and the personal reflection, Natalia. Good to hear. Do you have any thoughts or anything to add at the moment, Tor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's really intriguing, this necessity of self-reflection and seeing your own role, while at the same time thinking of the larger picture. And I think it's important to not wipe out differences. They need to be expressed, rather. It's quite clear that one can talk about complementary roles here. And I spoke in the first chapter about this saktmod, the way of not getting too
ahead of yourself.
Yeah, and think that my issue is the only important one, which Leo also said. But on the other side, it's the opposite also. If we don't do this, we might jump in that question for Amos as well there. Then, well, here it's horrible because they have a lithium mine. Here it's horrible because they have oil drilling. But who is going to present the complete alternative, which is financed, which is addressing the militarization in all the countries, and not only in terms of Russia or whatever. So there is sort of how, and that's where I feel there's a strength in Eleanor's, who says, well, we have to recognize now that they will not solve these things. So how to, and at the same time, take care of yourself. How to deal with this impossibility.
Well, I mean, and the sort of the self-reflection that Natalia showed in her comment recently, that it does say that, you know, where do you find your power?
Yeah.
And we've heard sort of Greta Thunberg mentioned today, and, you know, she found her power by breaking the law, you know, the law saying that young people have to be in school. She didn't do that, and that was her expression of her power, breaking that particular law. And we've also heard this evening about, you know, how to develop power. And we've heard from Amos that the Extinction Rebellion there and the climate justice movement kind of ran out of power when given some kind of pushback. So I wonder, how do we deal with power, and how do you think you develop, you personally, and perhaps your generation, coming generations, how, you know, where does power come from, and how do we develop it in a productive for life way? Amos, what do you think?
Sure. I mean, Extinction Rebellion has kind of a fixed rule system and kind of a effort to develop something called like holocracy, but it's kind of just basically its basis democracy from like the similarly that has been done in kind of direct action movements for decades. So it's shared meetings and consensus building. But so this has led to constant like debates on whether this is ineffective or whether there's too much power forming to certain people. And I mean, it's a learning process, but I think it's there has not been as much, I think, focus on societal power, how to gain societal power and influence. This is then where I think conversations more with people involved in party politics or NGOs or other forms of organizing have been kind of influential also in the movement. But the view on power, it was a big step for the movement to generally deal with money, just have euros and some money accounts, because we were kind of have a quite strong like moral also a project of voluntary asceticism also in the movement, and in that sense we are kind of a Gandhian movement. But then it was a big issue to, okay, if we have money, we are also part of networks of power and extraction that are hard to oversee, and thus that has been kind of a compromise that we did in the last years. That okay, money is a central resource for doing many things, but not all things. But it can help in certain things. So this has led to maybe another kind of view on power and what kind of interest we are kind of engaged in when we try to influence politics. On a larger scale, I think the movement is kind of going in that way in different directions. That there are kind of very strong critique, kind of anarchist tradition critiques of power in itself, as power being authoritative and kind of problematic per se. Are quite strong, these tendencies in the movement, but also tendencies that are more people who are even involved and part of political parties. And those people then have a direct influence to policy making, which has been a useful thing also for the movement to have kind of people in different parties. So the relationship to power is quite ambivalent, and we do not have, but generally the thing I'm more used to saying to the public when they ask about power and our relationship to authority is that we are a horizontal grassroots movement without any leader, and that's kind of the talking point that is often brought up, and that is how it is. And it might be, I think it's great that there are people like Greta Thunberg who can give a face to the movement and express the strong kind of also the feelings and the kind of depth of the issue. But personally, now after Natalia's your kind of description of what your engagement in the movement, I think there's there's a certain comfort, but also a kind of it's not easy to it's kind of I'll be mostly more involved in organizing kind of background work for the moment, in the kind of how to get more people on board and keep the kind of train going, so to say.
So, Natalia, if we say that we need to develop our own power, and there's a sort of a problem with that, because if we get our power from the system, then we're dependent. We also create a dependence on the system, and power can also be seen as something bad that we have from, sort of we're not trying to have power over each other. We build horizontal structures and organizations, which, I don't know, maybe does that disempower us, do you think? The horizontal organizing and do we trip ourselves up?
Through the de-hierarchization, you mean? Is that what you're?
Yeah, through our unclear relationship with power. If I say so, we need to develop our own power, but it's also associated with problematic things and structures, and we think that our power comes from those structures. Is there something that you've seen in your work, or any reflections that come to you now about how we can develop our thinking together about power?
Yeah. Well, my experience, for instance, this asylum law initiative that I'm really active in right now, it is a very left hierarchy project. So we really try to reflect on the hierarchies that we have through some people knowing more about the process, blah, blah, blah. So all these kinds of informal hierarchies that still exist. And I think that we have been going through a process where we also realize that it's important to tackle these issues, and it's important to make it transparent when we feel like there's power dynamics within our group that could also make participants uncomfortable. But I think that what we realized, and I'm also glad that we made this decision as a group, that our objective should be on the outcome of our work more than on how we feel within the group. And I think that right now we're at a place where we try to find a middle path between having these internal discussions and these internal reflections about power and what it makes and what it means for our group, but we try to keep them as small as possible, because we know that it takes resources from us that we want to see somewhere else. And I do feel like it's, for me personally, yeah, I tend to get frustrated, or I think that there's also some frustration that comes to some point, because power is something very natural, and I think that no matter how much time you spend into reflecting on it, you cannot dissolve these dynamics that come up within groups. And yes, I think that for us it was a very important decision, and it made our work way more effective from now on. And I think in these situations, even in this decision that we made, it was important that we had some kind of power dynamics that gave us some clarity, because then it makes some opinions stand out a bit more than others, and make some opinions be a bit more dominant than others. And to me, it really depends on the movement and on the project, I think, but especially in our project, where we have a very clear objective and where we know what we need, specific outcomes, and we want to help and be there for for refugees and do this law consultations, we needed these, we needed to accept these power dynamics, I think, or it was a common decision to accept them in order to focus on our work more than internal processes. But yeah, I think it can also rip apart groups, of course. So it always needs to be, I think you need to confront this decision with some sensitivity and yeah.
Yeah, it can rip apart groups. Any thoughts at the moment, Tord?
Yeah, I wonder about this. Was Amos talked about is that when this war now, both Ukraine and Gaza, takes the attention, that became a bit of a challenge for the climate justice movement. And I wonder why did not the climate justice movement address the militarization earlier then? It could have been the possibility to maybe sort of be able to combine the issues rather than compete for my issue is the important one. And I guess,
yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think many movements, I mean, and people in general were shocked about the full-scale invasion when it started. And then there was a kind of moment in which pro-NATO actors had kind of saw the opportunity and made a kind of great effort to suddenly get both Finland and Sweden into the military alliance. And in this kind of moment, I think it was a limit of both the climate justice movement and the peace movement that we were not, that would have been a moment to kind of where things started moving in people's minds and they tried to look for new answers with the full-scale war, and then they went for kind of easy hard security, very militarized answers to the new constellation with the war. But the climate movement could have, maybe there could have been something else, and I think Folk och Fred represents kind of the something else that could have been, and that is here. One thing that I might say about power still, and the relationship to power, and kind of think about what Eleanor presented, think about politicians as a different group from us, the people. That has been a theme, how to relate to the parliament, kind of elected officials, members of parliament, has been a conversation in quite many countries in the climate movement. Now, the reason why it became an important thing in Finland was that some extinction rebellion activists, together with Återställ våtmarker, Restore the Wetlands, Swedish activists, spray painted the Finnish parliament with red paint to protest against peat mining in Finland. And a week later, members from all the Finnish parties in parliament signed, or kind of in public said that they do not accept this behavior, and 100,000 people signed a petition to criminalize the organization. And it was quite a big shift in general attitude, the biggest seen actually ever for extinction rebellion in Finland. And there are similar experiences. I spoke with Czech activist friends who said that they are considering to have some kind of, they say, action consensus often the movement that says what actions are acceptable. For example, non-violence is often non-negotiable. And then he was thinking that also kind of he was engaged in the legal work, and he said that the movement, if it would be considered against the rule of law, against the Rechtsstaatsprinzip in German, I mean, then it could be sedition charges could rise, and thus any action that would be possibly facing sedition charges or could be read by the general public, or be by the state as anti-democratic in the sense of being against the kind of legitimate established democratic institutions is more risky in a deeper sense and can face a harder backlash. So this is conversation we had in the movement. Okay, should we try to focus our efforts? We have been fighting the big corporations, the government, but then when suddenly our actions are read as a direct attack on the democratic institutions and the rule of law, I mean, for scandalously stupid reasons, I mean, it had nothing to do with that, but still, we risked losing the whole movement, or kind of the legal ability to have any kind of legal structures in the movement with this action, and many our friends in Let's Say Generation and comrades in other movements have faced sedition charges and kind of got shut down for similar reasons. So in that way, it's I think a relationship to power and established democratic institutions is a ongoing conversation, and as you can see, I'm a bit concerned that there's big risks, and I think that there's something to defend, as you, Natalia, said, in both human rights. They can be resources, and also in the established democratic institutions such as rule of law. I think they are at risk. Now with the new right rising, I think there's something worth defending there. And this is would a few years ago be a very moderate stance within the movement, very problematic even. But I think in hard times, it is we have kind of a new, more defensive strategy at the moment in the movement.
Yeah, I think both of you have really, it's so interesting, because this is the way things have to move, is by doing things. And Eleanor talked about direct action. This painting of the parliamentary pillars, it was really direct action. And one can, of course, start to question everything. But in reality, it showed that suddenly there is a great change in the whole way democracy works when you criminalize, tries to make a big thing about criminalizing a whole organization for what some individuals are doing and so on. So actually it's a sort of, it shows that what Eleanor says is important, but also, and that's where I think what you, Natalia, said is in it, because your issue has been relevant all the time. These things about refugees, etc., it's been a key issue, and less and less people have sort of been interested in it. So how to find ways of doing it? And if I understood you right, you found out that it was important to address these internal things, but finally you came to the conclusion that most important is that there actually is an outcome. And that, I think, is an excellent thing. What I see as a problem then, and a question, is how come that this issue of refugees and asylum rights, etc., which I don't think is a question of refugees to separate them into war refugees, climate refugees, or economic refugees, all are should be treated the same. How come that this issue has been downplayed so much the last years? And how can you challenge the peace movement and the climate justice movement to make all refugees issues, not as climate or war refugees, but all refugee issues more important in this coming together? Not only the repression issue, but also this refugee issue.
What was the question?
How can this refugee issue, how can we challenge the climate justice movement and the peace movement to address the refugee issue as a common issue?
Yeah, very good question. I wondered about this as well, because I feel like in a subtle way it is very present, as you said, and I do feel like in my surrounding there was always some sensitivity or awareness about this in any kind of movement. But I think that a big issue of this this is that the way we think about the refugee topic is very targeted in the sense of what I also mentioned as in, okay, we need to do something for them and we're the givers and they will be the receivers. And I think that this creates an imbalance that also makes people think about the topic of not being maybe on the same eyesight as them. And that's maybe why also movements, like very wide movements in Europe, when being confronted with this topic and having internalized this attitude of us, the fortunate, giving something maybe to the more unfortunate, I think that emotionally it for sure makes you blend out the fact that that those people are in the same fight as us, and that we should not stay within our hierarchical position and wait until we made a better world where we change the structures for them, but actually integrate these topics from the beginning on within our fight and make it part of our values and our goals right now. And I think this is a big problem that we have, and that a big attitude problem, I think, that needs to be resolved within movements also, and initiatives and political groups, I think.
Lovely. And on that note, we're going to say thank you to you, Natalia, and to you, Amos, for your participation, the work you've done in preparation for this, and the time you've given us this evening. Thank you very much. It's been enlightening and a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is also the end of the session this evening.